Okay, that's fine by me. Right, well, welcome everybody. What we're going to do is we've got an hour, haven't we? So I'll spend about 20 minutes talking to Dominic, and then it's over to you for questions. I'm sure you won't be reticent in your questions. This is becoming a habit. We did this last year, didn't we? So this will be a bit different. Leadership contest.
Yeah.
When you announced that you were standing, did you expect to win? Obviously, you hoped you would win, but what did you think the result was going to be?
I thought I had a good shot for various different reasons, and I think the European elections were
Professional at all times.
quite important in the dynamic that changed. But to be honest with you, I didn't do a lot of post-mortem. I thought that there was an agenda I wanted to talk about. I thought I had good support, which I did as a base to, and you know, you give it your best shot. But I've deliberately not post-mortemed the campaign, because now the leadership is done. I think we need to bring the family back together, and we need to all be rowing in the same direction. And actually, I think Boris has done a cracking job. I think the team is much more together. I think there is a real sense of course, lots of challenges, but a sense of gripping the problem, clear strategy notwithstanding all the tactical challenges. And I'm enjoying being part of a team that has really got the bit between its teeth.
Did you enjoy the experience? Because I suspect when you go into these kind of contests, you're not quite sure what to expect. And sometimes, I think particularly some of the fringe candidates, which you weren't, but some of the fringe candidates, I suspect, didn't enjoy the experience at all.
I loved it.
So you do it again?
I'm looking forward to fighting for this Prime Minister to stay in post for as long as is humanly possible.
Now, you've done your speech at the conference on Sunday. You articulated a vision for what you called a global Britain, which sounds a sort of slightly trite, soundbitey phrase. What do you actually mean by it?
So I want the vision for the UK beyond Brexit to be more than just the haggle with Brussels. It's important we get that relationship right. I'm half Czech, as you know. We discussed that last year.
And you're not the son of a bus driver.
I'm not the son of a bus driver.
It's unusual in the leadership contest.
But I am the son of a Czech refugee who came over here, and I feel no less European than I have ever done. So I want to get that on a straight footing. I just don't want to be part of the undemocratic political club. I want us, and I think as a government, we're articulating the progressive case for free trade, whether it's for consumers at home or for the poorest countries in Africa who have been held back under, I think, hypocritical EU and arguably Western protectionism for too long. But I also want it to be about more than just pounds and pence. So we are talking about Britain as a global force leading on climate change, having a sensible, smart, enterprise-driven, innovation-driven approach to that. I think we ought to be standing up for freedom around the world, which is what I was talking about yesterday in Hong Kong, obviously in relation to our dual nationals in Iran. And we're going to be bringing forward this Magnitsky law, which I campaigned for ever since 2012. In fact, the original backbench debate in the House of Commons was with David Miliband. He and I did it together, and that's something where actually I think we ought to be saying, look, if you commit gross human rights abuses like torture or other things, or you're profiting from them, you can't just waltz into the UK and take haven in London, in Belgravia or wherever else it is, and do your shopping in Knightsbridge, and in particular you can't launder your dirty money through British banks. So, and I think that's a very principled position. I think it's part of our USP, our place in the world, that we want to be a force for good. So I want it to be more than just Britain's place in the world, more than just about Brexit, and indeed, as yield to no one in my passion for free trade and the good it can do this country. But I also think that we're bigger than that, and we've got more to it than that. And so I'm just trying to put some meat on the bones.
So why hasn't the Magnitsky thing been done before in this country?
So there's a sort of policy and a political argument. I mean, we've done bits of it, but we've not done the full Monty, which is to effectively say we have a comprehensive regime, we start designating people in a very transparent way. And there is an argument, there's a diplomatic argument, that it will make your diplomatic relations harder. I think we need to take that on, actually. I think there's an argument for saying if we're going to engage, let's say in terms of free trade, as liberally as I think we should do all around the world, we ought to also be able to say, but do you know what, if there are individuals in that regime doing dastardly things, they don't just get to come to this country. And I think that is quite a nice buffer and buttress, moral buttress, to the buccaneering free trade approach. And politically, I think it does require us to be quite brave and to bold about it, because there'll be some countries that will turn around and say, well, in that case, we're not going to deal with you for 6 months. And I think it's great credit to the Prime Minister that he said, you know what, amidst all the other things going on, actually, we should be a beacon for freedom in the world.
Does it help having a Prime Minister who's been Foreign Secretary, who understands the way the Foreign Office works, or sometimes doesn't?
It unequivocally helps. I think I have to say. There's always. I think it does help. Boris felt very passionately about the Foreign Office, and the Foreign Office had huge respect and affection for him, much more than
Did it?
Yeah.
Because that's not what we read in the newspapers.
Well, there you go. There's a lesson to be derived from that, but I shall leave you to draw it. But no, genuinely there is, and there's, for example, the campaign to protect journalists around the world, which I talked a bit about yesterday, and that's something that he started. And it's a good example where we don't, we talk about the US, the EU and the big blocs, but that's something where actually we're shoulder to shoulder with the Canadians on. And there are also these sorts of themes that I think are part of the Global Britain narrative, working with partners that maybe we haven't shown as much love to recently as we should have done. Maybe that's partly what being in the EU and locked into that rather navel-gazing insular approach has meant. But that's one example, and there are many others, where actually he's really blazed a trail. And they've not been, and again, I'll pay tribute to Jeremy as well. I actually think we've had a succession of very good but very different foreign secretaries. So I want to take that forward.
When you were a lawyer in the Foreign Office all those years ago, how long were you there as?
2000 to 2006.
And did it ever cross your mind that one day you could be in the Foreign Secretary's office as Foreign Secretary?
I've crossed my mind. But, but I wasn't really into politics. And as a civil servant, believe it or not, I joined the party in 2005, which is pretty late if you look at the 2010 intake. And one of the reasons was because I instinctively felt that the civil servants, because of the impartiality that's required of us and the professionalism, that it would be wrong to mix the two things. And I sometimes thought that I went into politics too late as a result of it, but in any event, I've always been very mindful of that distinction and to respect the impartiality of the civil service. And when I was there in 2003, or 2000 to 2006, obviously it was in the wake of the Second Iraq War, and I definitely saw this tussle and tension between the politicians and the civil servants, from the civil servants' point of view, in relation to the SOFA government and the Alistair Campbell spin that was put on things. And we had a little bit of, obviously seen it from a different side as Brexit Secretary with all the challenges we had, which I'm not particularly keen to rake over because I think we've got it onto a much better footing.
Come on to that later then.
But my point is, actually I think there is something to be said from seeing it from the other side of the fence in terms of respecting the role that the civil servants do. I think we've got terrific civil servants. The machine is quite cumbersome from time to time, but the argument and I think the answer is to have political grip and to tap the best of the talent and the expertise we've got in the civil service.
And did you expect to become Foreign Secretary when Boris was forming his government? Had you had discussions with him about what role you might like? Because I know you did have some discussions along those lines. So
when I came out of the race, I deliberately made it clear I didn't want to have any conversations about that. I said that publicly, I said it with him. I think a Prime Minister needs to have the total freedom to form the best team, best candidates for the jobs individually, and the best balance. And I think it's rather unsavoury to go in and say, well, I might support you if you do this or that. So I unconditionally supported him. And I also think there's just some integrity to that, personally. I'm not knocking other people who went about it a different way, but and I don't think it does you any harm because it demonstrates that you're just someone that gets stuck in. And I think if you're looking for team players, and boy, do we need a bit of that now, it's probably no bad thing.
So how did the conversation go?
I'll support you unconditionally and I'll do it tomorrow.
No, I meant when he actually asked you to become Foreign Secretary.
Around the cabinet table, and he said, I'd like you to be my Foreign Secretary and also like you to be my First Secretary.
You said, I'll have to think about it.
No, I didn't say that. Yeah, look, terrific, great, it's a dream job. I won't want to make too much of it, but if you come from a background like mine, my father came here with nothing, the idea that you could then be Foreign Secretary and looking at Britain's place in the world and dealing with some of those issues around the international scene, both within Europe and elsewhere, it's fantastic, it's a dream. And it's a dream to be doing it right now, notwithstanding all the challenges. Now, it couldn't be a more privileged time to be Foreign Secretary with this crossroads we've got. And so, look, there's challenges, but I feel really good about the position and the potential we're in. And I just loathe this self-fulfilling, self-defeating pessimism. So I think we've certainly not got a Prime Minister who engages in that. He's got the optimism, the fizz and the buzz, and I hopefully will be, as a Foreign Secretary, convey some of that at the international level.
Do you suffer from imposter syndrome at all?
Unpack that a little for me.
Well, I think a lot of people feel that when they get to a certain point in their careers, that they think. I mean, I can remember the first time I ever walked through Parliament when I worked for an MP back in the 1980s, and on my first day, I walked past former Prime Minister Jim Callaghan with President Ford, and I thought, what's a boy from Essex like me doing in a place like this?
See.
And I still feel that to an extent in the kind of work I do now. And I think a lot of politicians actually are not the self-confident people that they portray. But I mean, if you go into the White House to meet Donald Trump, you must be thinking, shit, what if I get this wrong? He might be thinking the same thing, I don't know.
I don't think he was thinking that. There's a bit of that. I guess, I go into the thing, I've had some ministerial experience now, and you want to hit the ground running and straight out of the gate exert the grip and the professionalism that we talked about. So I'm straight into that, and I don't think about it too much. I didn't realise I was going to the Oval Office. I was meeting the Vice President. But straight away you realise that there's a message that you're being sent, and the reason the President invited me in was not because of me. It was he wanted to tell us how much he loves Britain. We haven't heard that for a while from a US President. He wanted to say how much he admired our Prime Minister. He wanted to ask a few questions about what was going on in Parliament, and it was his way of wishing us well. And look, great privilege, but for those that don't like Donald Trump, on whichever side of the political spectrum, obviously there's a huge opportunity to serve the interests of the United States and the United Kingdom, and it would be frankly self-indulgent not to be just welcome and appreciative of this opportunity, whether it's on a free trade deal, whether it's on the other cooperation that we prize between our two countries. So it's a great opportunity, and I was very, walking to the Oval Office is something else I'll remember. But I was very clear-eyed in my mind that this is obviously being done for a reason, and we must make the best of it.
And was it a free-flowing conversation? I mean, how do you have bants with Donald Trump?
It wasn't so much bants, if I'm honest. But it's interesting, and I want to be careful to protect the integrity of the conversation, but it's interesting because he's got his trusted advisors there, the Vice President, Secretary of State Pompeo, the brilliant ambassador here, Woody Johnson, who'd tracked back to make sure the meetings all went well. And it was interesting, I think, the way the President tests his ideas. And the way he reaches out to test those ideas with his trusted advisors, and then obviously with me as a guest. So that was kind of interesting, because people have got different styles of leadership, and I think a lot of people have debated and dissected the way Donald Trump goes around making decisions. So I suppose it was at least a flavour of how he does it.
I suppose the reason I ask about the imposter syndrome is I think it's a natural human thing to think, well, am I up to this job? I mean, we all find our level in life in the end, I suppose. And it's natural to be a little bit nervous, I guess. You don't strike me as somebody who does get particularly nervous, but maybe you hide it.
I think, I do get nerves. But someone asked me this other day, and if you've done, I've boxed, I've done martial arts for God knows how many years. I've never been as nervous as competing in that frame, and I think it always rather prepared me quite well. I'm not saying it's the perfect analogy, but I think if I get nervous, I kind of try and focus on, okay, what are we going to do here? The nerves are fine, that'll keep me on my game, and then get on with it. And so as long as you're not, I think nerves are great, as long as you're not trapped by them.
And on that first day in the Foreign Office, were you conscious that there were people, I don't know if you do one of these big welcoming things to all the staff, you must have been conscious there were people there that would have been working with you when you were now but a slip of a lad, thinking, well, he's come a long way, is he up to it?
Well, the guy that organised the first open staffer who worked for me when I was in The Hague, the chief, Sir Iain MacLeod, the legal advisor, was my first line manager. So there's all these relationships around the office. But the Foreign Office at its best is super professional. So there's a sly, sneaking admiration, or respect, I think, and I've got lots of friendships in the Foreign Office. But at the end of the day, we've all got jobs to do. And let's face it, with all of the shenanigans that we've got going on in Parliament, it wasn't exactly a lot of time to pause and think about these things. You just wanted to get on with it. It is a bit like walking into a museum, though. I mean, I get your point about Parliament. I had that first time around with the Foreign Office. Maybe that helped. When I went there from the city, from Linklaters in 2000, I had all that sense of being slightly starstruck to be in the Foreign Office.
Yeah.
Maybe second time around, I was just a bit ready for it.
Now, what do you think is the biggest strategic foreign policy risk for the UK, and how are you responding to that?
So I think it's a bit like the fox, Isaiah Berlin's Fox and the Hedgehog. I don't think there's one big risk. I think there's lots of different challenges. And sometimes it's the second order risks that you're not paying enough attention to that catch you out. So if you look at, you've obviously got Brexit, we've got the wider free trade agenda, which I think is really all upside for us. There's Iran, there's China, there's cyber, some of the asymmetric threats. And I think one of the real challenges with the amount of and the volume of work, particularly with the Brexit subcommittees of Cabinet now, is making sure you can carve out to the what I call the sort of 60-40 rule of you're going to in a Foreign Office type job, be 60% reactive to what's going on, but at least preserve a third to 40% to think strategically and be ahead of the curve. So I'm not sure I'm there yet, but that's what we try to do.
There was that big picture of Boris Johnson at the UN with President Rouhani from Iran, both of them laughing their heads off, which in a sense you think, well, that's a good thing because they were, I suppose, getting on. But when you look at the relationship that we and the Americans have with Iran at the moment, and I mean, there are all sorts of different things, the nuclear deal, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, I suppose the optics of that to her family wouldn't have been particularly great. Are you looking to reset relations with Iran?
Whether I call it a reset or not, I'm not sure. The way I would put it is, I mean, I spent some time in Iran. I negotiated under the reformist regime of President Khatami a bilateral investment protection agreement at a time where there were high hopes that Iran would come in from out of the cold. And we want, and I want, Iran to be able to do that. I think it's an incredible country, huge potential, very well educated population. I think relatively in the Middle East that's certainly true. Very hospitable. I had a birthday there. I think it was in 2003. It was dry, but it was a very hospitable birthday nonetheless. And the interesting thing at that time was you'd walk down the street in Tehran. We went out for dinner, and you would see the young women, very well educated, very elegant, very proud, challenging the authorities by pushing the headscarf as far back across their head as they could get away. And you realise you're in a different kind of Middle Eastern society. And so I think it's a country with great potential. The problem is they're held back by a regime that doesn't adhere to the basic tenets of international law. They don't do it on dual nationals. They don't do it with those attacks on Aramco. They're not doing it with freedom of navigation. So there's a quite simple route for Iran back to international respectability, which is what will free them up to be a fully fledged member of the international community and to be able to prosper because of the easing of sanctions. And that's to stick to the rules of the game. So it's quite a simple equation. And I think their behaviour has got worse, not better. And we need to be absolutely clear that whilst we want de-escalation and the UK doesn't sign up to the US maximum pressure doctrine, there also needs to be consequences for perpetually and persistently disregarding basic rules of international law, which they are bound by and they've signed up to.
So were you in this meeting at the UN with Rouhani?
I was in DC at the time,
right?
But I'd spoken to the foreign minister before.
And what's it like dealing with, I mean, the Iranian foreign minister is Zarif, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, he's portrayed in the media here as a moderate, if you can have a moderate in a regime like that. Is dealing with him, when you have conversations with him, just the same as any other foreign minister, or are there sort of certain things areas you don't go?
I don't think there can be any areas that you don't go in terms of protecting British national interests. Otherwise, you're sending all the wrong messages. And one of the things I worry about in foreign policy more than other things is moral hazard, which is not acting and therefore the damage you do later down the track because the wrong message is learned. And each foreign minister is different, but effectively what you want to do, in my view, is establish a rapport which it can be relaxed and can be even jovial, even with difficult partners, particularly, as you said, they're regarded as on the more reformist side of things, but always be able to speak very candidly. Because the one thing you don't want is things getting lost in translation, whether it's literally in translation or in diplomatic translation. So I'm a great believer, in fact, in all relationships, of being very clear with people, and also encouraging them to do the same. But I had a very candid conversation with Carrie Lam and the Chinese Foreign Minister as well. So it's not particular to Iran.
What's the most difficult conversation you've had so far?
Since being Foreign Secretary?
No, just in your entire life.
I don't know. I get good advice, so they've all been manageable. But
are there conversations, though, when you pick up the phone and you're really thinking, this could go terribly wrong if I'm not careful?
A little bit, but then that's what we prepare for, and that's why I said you want that 60-40 balance, so that you've got the time just to be able to think very carefully. I think the consular cases, and not just in Iran, are quite difficult. When I was a Foreign Office lawyer, I worked on the consular cases. I think they can be pretty heartbreaking. And on the one hand, there's your professional judgment as a diplomat, and then there's the, my kids are 4 and 6. I can't bear to be away from them for a week, let alone months or longer. And so there's all that human side to it as well. I think those, when you're dealing with those consular cases, can be very difficult.
I guess you've got to be careful on this, but Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, I think many people in this room would, if you freed her, I think many people would see that as one of the biggest things that could happen in politics nowadays. I've interviewed her husband on several occasions, and I mean, what a brave man he is. But you think, well, what he's having to put up with is nothing compared to what she is. I mean, can you give any ray of hope on that?
So, of course, the more, and this is the tragedy of it, and I'm going to be very careful because I've met Richard twice, and I'm not going to, we don't do that. But I think people understand that the moral hazard comes in again, because the more we look like we're offering things and trying to grease the wheels, if I can put it like that, to secure Nazanin's release, the more you're upping the price tag that is being put on her, the value that she represents to the Iranians, if, as Jeremy Hunt said, she's a political hostage. I'm not quite sure about the analogy, and so you have to be quite careful with that. But the reality is that she's held, in my view, in the UK government's view, in totally arbitrary and unlawful way. It is totally unacceptable. It's not just the UK that this is happening to Australians, it's Canadians and others, Americans. It's totally, totally unacceptable. And what we need to do, one of the things we're trying to do with Iran more generally, is galvanise the wider international community so that we act in concert. Iran is sensitive to being isolated, but its sense of being isolated is different for most countries. I mean, but it was very important in the wake of the Aramco attacks, and people say, people criticise the Prime Minister, but he secured E3, so the France and Germany, coming out at the same time as the UK, US and Saudi, calling out Iran as responsible for those Aramco attacks. So that's the steady, patient work of diplomacy. And I guess the answer, the release of Nazanin will come when there's maximum international support, because that's the point at which the international community will be most effective. But I'm not going to offer false hope.
Well, and of course it's not just her, is it?
No, there's several. And there's many other countries where we have this challenge. But that is a particularly heartbreaking case.
Clear up something, because when Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary, we were constantly told that European leaders didn't like him, that he annoyed them, that he upset them. And yet, in his meetings with Angela Merkel, I nearly said François Mitterrand, Emmanuel Macron, and indeed at the G7, you kind of got the impression that they were rather surprised by him in some way. I mean, you were presumably at a lot of those meetings. Just give us a flavour of their reaction to him.
Well, first of all, as Foreign Secretary, everywhere I go, everyone is desperate to tell me how much they love Boris and to say congratulations to him as Prime Minister. When I'm out at ASEAN at the Asia-Pacific meeting in Bangkok, they are all, oh, how's Boris? And there was also a lot of respect for the work that had been done with him. I talked a bit about that Canadian initiative on media freedoms, all sorts of other things. So he's very disarming. And the thing that we all love about him at this conference, and his ability to connect, and his ability to nurture rapport and to reach out to people and frankly also to empathise a little bit and to think through it with the left side of the brain as well as the right side of the brain, it's actually great diplomatic skill as well, and he's got it. So people do like him, they want him. He's also equally an easy target. But I thought it was very telling. I made an aside about it yesterday. But when he went to Luxembourg, he had a very good meeting with Jean-Claude Juncker. You could see it. Juncker came out and was very positive about it. There's a deal to be done. We can do a deal. And then you've got the Luxembourg Prime Minister trying to ambush him. And the one thing about this Prime Minister, and it feeds the other debate that we're having about, the intemperate nature of politics, he doesn't take all of that to heart. He gets attacked so much in so many different ways, but I always think he brushes it off and he stays good-humoured and good-natured about it.
You say that, though, but isn't he somebody who actually really wants to be liked? I remember doing the leadership hustings, when he got questions from the audience that were quite to the point about him personally, he looked personally bereft that somebody could dare to think that somebody, I think it was in Nottingham, so he said, this letterbox comment, you're a racist, Mr. Johnson, aren't you? And the look on his face, he was genuinely shocked that someone could even possibly think that of him. And there was a couple of other instances where I thought, well, you're actually a lot more sensitive than you might give on.
A human being, who would like to take that? We all talk about wanting our politicians to be a bit more like ordinary human beings. Who wants to be accused of that? And if you read that article, and people have different views on it, but there was clearly a broader liberal case that he was making, however colourful that language was. So of course he doesn't want to be accused of being a racist. Who does? And he's all leaders are human beings and will have their, he's got a heart and we've all got our sensitivities. But I think that notwithstanding that, he's incredibly resilient and he doesn't hold grudges and he doesn't seem to take the personal attacks in a way which, he doesn't there's no knee-jerk reaction to it. And yet he is under fire constantly, in particular from some of those who are the first to complain about the use of language and tone. So I think there's a bit of hypocrisy around there at the moment.
Have you talked to him about these allegations made by Charlotte Edwards and all the Sunday Times allegations about Jennifer Mercuri?
No.
Sajid has.
He'd be a ripe topic for an in-conversation with you, but I haven't.
But what do you make of it? Because you look at the bare facts as we know them, and he clearly did have some sort of relationship with this American lady, and money was transferred from the Mayor of London's office or the Greater London Authority to her. On the face of it, that doesn't look good, does it?
Look, he said very clearly there's been no impropriety and he's proud of his record as Mayor. I think it is a politically motivated attack, but he will continue to answer the questions on it. I'm the Foreign Secretary, I've got enough on my plate.
Okay. Haven't asked about Russia. I haven't really asked about Brexit. I'm going to leave everyone else to do that. So let's open up the questions. I'm sure there's a lot of questions. Can you say who you are and where you're from? And don't make speeches, please. Let's get as many questions as we can. Gentleman there.
Hello, my name is Brian Weller. I was very fortunate to be able to speak to the American ambassador at the Carlton Club at dinner, and I was just wondering, I spoke to him about his president's concerns about the globalism as a threat to national sovereignty in America, and what kind of relationship we have in regards to that as an international alliance in future.
What's the question for me?
I mean, is it?
Sorry to be...
As part of the deal, could we actually have more protection for national sovereignty as regards to international bodies?
Well, look, one of the reasons we're leaving the EU is we want to take back democratic control. But I don't think that means that you can be anti-internationalism. And I think you can want lots of strong networked relationships, as we do with the Americans. I mean, we've got terrific relationship with the Americans on intelligence, on security. We want to have one on free trade. I don't think either side think that we need to give up democratic control, whether it's legislative control or judicial control, in order to do that. That's the shame, I think, of the situation, the way the EU is involved. Don't want to badmouth the EU, but that's the challenge.
We're at a Conservative conference. If you can't do it here, you can't do it anywhere.
That's true. But I'm not really in the business. I wanted to make just a point that actually you can be an internationalist, but also want to be an internationalist abroad, but want to preserve your democratic prerogatives at home. Isn't that what we Brexiteers want? Yes. It's not about looking inwards. My father was Czech, my wife's Brazilian. I've got two Brazilian boys at home. I wanted to have...
Brazilian, have you just created a word?
I've been at it a while. But I want my boys to have international outlook and global horizons. I want it for my kids and for our country. I just want us to be masters of our own destiny.
Right, lady here.
Marjorie Bayliss, Devon area. When you worked at the Foreign Office previously, were there attitudes or things they did that really got on your pip? And did you fantasise to yourself, if ever I was in charge, I'd change these, and now you are in charge, are you going to do that?
I didn't fantasise a lot during my time at the Foreign Office. There's all sorts of things around, I guess, the free trade agenda, the relationships. I've got prejudice, which is I think that there's an intellectual laziness, which means that we constantly think in terms of the biggest nations in the world, whether it's the US, China, and in relation to the EU, where actually the scope for very productive, innovative relationships which yield greater bang for the buck for the British taxpayer or greater influence in various areas can be done through a lot of the mid-ranking powers where we have a closer commonality of interest. So the American relationship is very important. I think the European partnership is too. But what about the Canadians, the Koreans, the Brazilians, the Australians?
Canadian ambassador is nodding there.
Yeah, she... Well, we love our Canadian, and I got on terrifically with Christian Freeland. I think and of course, there is this, as I said before, this importance around the integrity of respecting the independence of the civil service. But I was quite surprised when I left the Foreign Office that they gave me this massive... I went to work for David Davis as his Chief of Staff. I followed in your footsteps.
You did. You did a better job than I did.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Oh, I was wondering when you'll chirp up, my lord.
I'm not sure that's fair. He resigned on my watch. But they gave me this big card of Margaret Thatcher, and what was quite interesting was all the people who were quite sympathetic to the Tory party, God forbid, in the civil service, came out and quietly would confess to me that they were secret Tories. So you find, all of these things, but actually that independence is really important. And there's huge talent. I mean, the one thing, and actually the Prime Minister said this to me, and I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying it, we as a country are this is something where Brexit has allowed us to lose our vim and vigour and our sense of self-belief. And one of the things the Prime Minister said is he wants to get that back for the United Kingdom, and he wants me to go and imbue that in the Foreign Office. And I think that with the lead he's taken, and I think there's a compliment being paid to the Foreign Office with the First Secretary role going with me there as well, and a sense of, this is a world of opportunities, not just this grey bookkeeping risk management exercise which Brexit had, I'm afraid, become under Theresa, as much as I respect her. And that is what it become. We'd lost the fire, the electricity, the hope that got 17 million people to think that Brexit was a route to a renaissance, a democratic renaissance at home and global horizons abroad. We've got to get that back.
I think it's really interesting. I interviewed the former Australian Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, recently, and he said exactly that. He said, why is everyone in this country so depressed? You've got a big future ahead of you. Just get your confidence back. It's easy to say, I suppose, but that's how a lot of people view us now, I think, particularly in the Commonwealth.
Totally agree. And you've got to be careful of this, but I said it in the speech yesterday. Everywhere I go outside of the Berlaymont building or the particularly tricky customs we've got in the EU, people are really enthused by the Global Britain agenda. What they tend to ask is, are you serious about this? Can you really do this? Are you going to get free from the EU? Will you, in the free trade arrangements, will you have the latitude to actually negotiate, or you can be locked into the EU rules? Are you here to stay? Will you back up the rhetoric with actions? That's exciting. That's a great gauntlet to get laid down to us as a country. And the opportunities for us, the material opportunities in terms of making the economy more innovative, creating more opportunities, not less, for the next generation, are enormous.
Right, gentleman over there. In fact, let's have, seeing as there's two questions next to each other, let's have both at once.
David McPhee, Glasgow. Change of tone, Dominic. Could you outline the circumstances where you believe that British military intervention in foreign countries would be an acceptable policy for us to pursue in light of the hangover from all of the stuff that's gone on, the previous interventions, perhaps tying into the idea of more vim, vigour, a more muscular approach to foreign policy?
Hi, I'm Guinevere. I handle foreign affairs at Dodds. I wanted to ask about a statement that Liz Truss made to Parliament last week on Saudi arms exports, and she blamed the mistakes that have been made recently partly on a lack of information sharing between departments, and that includes the FCO. So I was just wondering if you could give a comment on that and how you are tackling that issue.
So on military intervention, I think it's very precarious to start articulating a theory or a fixed set of criteria, but obviously in self-defence, including anticipatory self-defence, then we would need to defend the UK and indeed our allies if so asked. Obviously, if there's a UN Security Council mandate, as tricky as that is, I think that gives a blessing and the political support for it. And there are exceptional cases like the right of humanitarian intervention in relation to, you think of the Yugoslavia precedent. I just think it's a bit like the Hippocratic Oath for doctors. I do think we need to think do no harm. And so I'm not sure I take a theological approach to this. All of these circumstances are different. And again, I talked a little bit about this yesterday. I think we need to know what we're getting into. We need to know what we're up for, and we've got the resources to back it up, that we can reconcile the means to the ends that we're achieving. But of course, places like Sierra Leone, which we, have helped that country turn itself around, something that we should be proud of. What you don't want to get dragged into is a quagmire or an intervention without any exit strategy. In relation to Liz's remarks, look, she's talked and we've, explained that any errors need to be put straight immediately. We look at our export license control regime very carefully. We've got one of the most robust and rigorous in the world. Of course, there's litigation ongoing in relation to some of those areas and countries, so we will always very carefully look at the outcome of that. And it's quite a complex area, but we just need to be absolutely clear that we're never selling arms in breach of the strong regime and the high standards that we set out. And when we talk about having a moral compass in foreign policy, I think that's a good example where that's really important.
Right, gentleman there.
Hi, I'm Alistair Thompson, and I was just wondering what is being done in particular with relationship to what's going on in Hong Kong to try and protect the British national overseas citizens?
So clearly there is a range of things going on. You have the overwhelming majority of people in Hong Kong protesting peacefully. There is clearly also some violence. Some of it looks pretty orchestrated. There's questions about whether it's linked to some of the armed, the criminal gangs there, and that's never acceptable. But there is clearly also disproportionate response to those peaceful protesters. The right of peaceful protest is reflected in the joint declaration that we have with the Chinese over Hong Kong, and which reflects itself the one country, two systems model that China advocates. So I think we're absolutely right, not just as a matter of general human rights law, but as a matter of the undertakings made to us in relation to Hong Kong, which are legally binding, to raise those issues. And I raised them both with Carrie Lam and the Chinese Foreign Minister. And I think we've seen some baby steps in the right direction. So Carrie Lam has said that she's going to reinforce the Independent Police Council. Let's see how credible that is. She's binned once and for all this extradition bill, and she's started instituting this political dialogue. The reality is that the people of Hong Kong, if you look at the demands of the protests, want to make sure they've got a credible universal franchise to be able to have control over their chief executive and the legislature. That is reflected in the basic law. And I think we need to see the stepping stones of political dialogue towards that. In relation to the BNOs, again, we come back to the same thing. The BNOs were part of the joint declaration. There was sort of an addendum to it, part of the wider deal we did with Hong Kong. Now, whilst we agreed to give them consular protection, we also were very clear that we weren't giving them the British citizenship. So I think we do need to be careful if we're going to ask China to stick to the deal on one country, two systems in the joint declaration, not to rip it up ourselves. Of course, if things change fundamentally, then would always keep it under review. But the B&O status comes with very clear criteria of what we would and wouldn't do. And I think if we're asking China to respect its side of the bargain, to put it like that, and we do want to do that, and we convey that message with our partners very clearly, I think we need to be respectful of what we agreed to do and what we agreed not to do.
Do you think our initial response to what was happening in Hong Kong was robust enough?
Well, it depends when you mean, but I think we were leading the way in saying very clearly that the internationally respected rights, recognised rights of peaceful protest must be respected, and that I raised this directly and candidly with our Chinese friends. In fact, I met the Chinese Foreign Minister when I was in Bangkok. It was the first meeting I did. But it's not about Falkland diplomacy, because I want to have we talked about the recipe for a good relationship. You want to be able to talk candidly, but you also want to preserve the relationship. So I don't think, I did a statement, an urgent question last week in the House of Commons on this. And I'm always like to be very straight with the public and the House of Commons about what I'm doing. But equally, I'm not sure that Falkland diplomacy is the right way to go. We deliver a clear and candid message, but we're also trying to coax and get China to do the right thing on Hong Kong.
Okay. Lady here.
Hello, Foreign Secretary. I'm Baiba Braja, Latvian ambassador here. We met a couple of times before. Yeah. My question is about the rule of law internationally, what Britain is able and willing to do. This year is the 80 years of Stalin-Hitler Pact, which divided Europe, setting the stage for the Second World War, which resulted, of course, in tragedy for your family, but also for many families all around Europe. And that was enabled by two totalitarian regimes floating all the rules that were there, that we had subscribed to. So what we, as democratic societies, as a West at large, being where we are, can actually do currently?
Well, it's quite an open-ended question, but I share your sentiments.
She means Russia.
No?
Okay, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Well, so I think we need to...
Signed up to the rules, the UN Charter, the Council of Europe Convention on Human Rights.
Exactly. I'd like to see us become even more active within the Council of Europe. There's lots of great work the Council of Europe does. I think within NATO, now more than ever, we need to stand up and make sure we focus NATO on the right priorities and keep the consensus. And of course, whatever else, I think the Americans have got a point about Europeans living up to their commitments in terms of military spending, but we want that to be a collaborative exercise. Fundamentally, I think it's interesting, and Iran shows this quite neatly. We can spend all the time haggling across the transatlantic divide, or we can be really effective together. And that's the basic choice. And that's what Iran looks out for, that's what China looks out for, that's what Russia looks out for. So we need to try and forge a stronger transatlantic consensus now more than ever. I think you started to see that, the G7, the Trump-Macron initiative. I think that's kind of interesting on Iran, and we fully support that. If it's the Straits of Hormuz, we're trying to protect international shipping. I say to our partners, American, North American, European, the argument shouldn't be about whether it's a French or American or a European or a North American flag. It should be, what is the broadest support that can give the clearest and most effective message to Iran? So maybe we need to haggle a bit less amongst ourselves and have a bit more cohesion. And of course, I know Brexit's rich coming from a Brexiteer, but actually there is an opportunity for a win-win deal on Brexit. And there is an opportunity to turn the page and look a bit more positively and get our relationship with the EU on a more positive footing. But that can only be if it's a two-way street. And I've long argued that, both here at home, but also when I was Brexit Secretary and now as Foreign Secretary. But we've got to get off the mindset that leaving the EU you must be punished, and that it can only ever be lose-lose and all the rest of it. I think you take a more pragmatic and forward-looking view of it, but there is sense of that amongst some of our partners. Because at the end of the day, the transatlantic consensus is likely to be the strongest and the most effective in dealing with all of the threats and the challenges I think you're touching on.
Right at the back, I can see a hand. I can't see whether it's a female or a male hand. Female, excellent.
Hi, Zara Heidi. I'm a former lawyer and I worked a lot in the Middle East on democratic governance. I want to go back to Iran and actually the question of the imprisonment of nationals, not foreign nationals, but nationals. Nasrin Sotoudeh has been sentenced to 38 years and 160 lashes. She was Shirin Ebadi's colleague, and Shirin Ebadi, obviously Nobel Prize winner. And since January, 8 environmentalists have been imprisoned without charge. And so one of the problems for, I'm from a Shia community, one of the problems for those who are more secular-minded for Iran is that the liberal elite is being hollowed out, the professionals, what have you. What more can the international community do, given the fact that Iran itself is quite isolated and there are probably some other priorities? But what can we do more to promote, if you like, the rule of law, respecting, due process in that country?
So I think in November Iran has its periodic report at the Human Rights Council. That's an opportunity for us to speak out about the values that we expect of all countries in the international community. And I think the way I see more generally the path for Iran is that we do need to de-escalate, and we do need to make sure, as we hold them to account for their violations of international law, that there is a path to international respectability. And foreign policy, sometimes bilateral relations can feel like an exercise of prisoner's dilemma. We do need to make sure that if Iran rows, there is, in the right direction, there is space for it to progress to a better place. We need to have that space, and at the same time, we need to be clear that if they don't, their isolation and their international reputation will only go from bad to worse. It's not there'll be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, I think, with Iran. And it's been a bit like that for about 20 years, realistically. So I don't think there's all of a sudden going to be a silver bullet answer or a magic wand. I think that the best hope is that you create the incentives and the checks and the balances where at various points you're incentivizing the right behavior, you're containing the worst behavior, and bits of the jigsaw puzzle slip into place. But in the end of the day, unfortunately, as frustrating as it is for you and for me when I look at the country, because I've spoken, and I mean it, about its potential, it can only come from Iran. And that's the reality.
Is a frustration with Iran that you are dealing with people who appear to be in power but actually aren't in power, like Rouhani and Zarif? They can only go so far because they know that they will be sat on by the religious leaders above them.
There's clearly a tussle between the reformers and the hardliners, and it's been like that in Iran since the revolution, really. And of course, when you analyse it, you've got to think, what is a gift for the hardliners, and what actually strengthens the hand of the reformists? And actually, Iran's not unique in that respect. You have that conversation. There's lots of countries around the world that are either growing economically or transitioning politically, where you look at it and it's a similar sort of matrix of considerations. But I think with Iran, you don't want to avoid the own goals and think very carefully about the second and third moves on the chessboard.
Right, gentleman there.
Thanks. Hi, Dom. It's Brooks Newmark. I'm a visiting academic at Oxford at the moment. As you know, I have a big interest in Syria. The reciprocal of the point made by the gentleman over there is what is the price of non-intervention. And we're seeing that in Syria today. There is no mechanism of an international criminal court, and I'm wondering if you've thought of an alternative mechanism, such as a Russell tribunal or a Russell court, where a mechanism can be held up, where you can hold them to account. Because we're seeing what's happening in Idlib now, where there are 4 million people who are now vulnerable, and we've already shown them a green light that they can do what they want with impunity. So unless there is a stick to beat them with, they will continue their bad behavior. And by that I mean both Assad and Putin.
So I definitely think there is a very strong international but also national imperative and value in trying to sow the seed of doubt in people, whether it's Assad or some despot or warlord in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that means that they think, well, do you know what, I can't just waltz off into the sunset to some luxurious retirement with a whopping great amnesty. And that's why the accountability for war crimes is so important. And the work, much maligned, of the Yugoslavia Tribunal, Rwanda Tribunal, Special Court for Sierra Leone and the ICC is important, imperfect as all these institutions are. And there's effectively about 3 or 4 ways you can do it, but you can either whisk people off to The Hague, but they need to sign up to the ICC if that's going to be the case, or there needs to be a UN Security Council resolution. You can set up an ad hoc tribunal, but that will require Security Council resolution. Of course, in Syria, the Russians would veto it. Or, and this would require host state consent, you set up domesticated war crimes trials, which effectively, with some international supervision, we did in Bosnia. But really, until you've got control of that situation, until the conflict is over and the despot, in this case Assad, is removed, it's very difficult to see how that will happen. It's just the reality on the ground.
Which part of the world do you think that Britain needs to really dramatically increase its influence in, and where there are most trade opportunities post-Brexit? Where do you think you've got to do a lot of legwork over the next couple of years?
I'd be very careful amongst with ambassadors in the audience to single out anyone. And
Canada and Latvia, obviously.
I think we're in a pretty good place with our Canadian and our Latvian friends. But I think one of the interesting places which has been neglected is Asia Pacific. So the TCP, CP, or there's probably not enough P's in there, or too many C's. But the Asia Pacific trade deal, I think is very interesting, very exciting. And I think the other one, and I be careful about this because with the Brazilian wife, everyone thinks that I'm trying to reorient the foreign policy of the United Kingdom around domestic bliss, which is not the case. But I do think there are opportunities in South America and with Mercosur, which will be much easier for us to tap than the EU because we're just less protectionist. And those two regions, I think, one's below the top level of the US and the EU, which I think are quite tantalising in the sense that 5, 10, 15, 20 years, they're the growth markets of the future, I think. So as well as nurturing our Commonwealth friends and the bigger players, I think there are some of the most exciting areas, those two.
Okay. So, in fact, let's have both of you next door to each other.
Hi, Oliver Clement, Surrey area. So I read your book, I read your book from 2009, and I was just wondering, going forward, what role you'd like to see the HRA and the ECHR play? And the important issue for the UK is Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, is that the UK must hold China to keep the 2047 rule in the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And my friend here thinks that the UK has been too weak on China in the last 20 years.
Does your friend have any idea what they want me to do with instead of too weak? And I'm all for muscular. I think someone display. What do you think the credible options are beyond the obvious coaxing and cajoling to respect the one country, two systems that China stands by, reflected in the Joint Declaration? What is it you think? What's the trick we're missing? And on the ECHR, HRA, I think we've been very clear that while we're getting Brexit done, there's no question of taking on the other hot potato of the Human Rights Act. But I do think, and I've always argued that, and our Latvian friend reminded me of this, that the ECHR, I mean, whatever people's views on the HRA, they don't disagree with the basic principles in the ECHR. And actually the convention, the European, the Council of Europe, does a lot of other terrific work in terms of democratic reform, election monitoring, and I think that's a good example of where we could do even more engaging within Europe, but outside of the EU. But I'm genuinely up for interesting thoughts on what you think on, or your friend thinks on Hong Kong we could do that we have been remiss in doing.
Right, we've got 5 minutes, I've been told. So let's have a gentleman here.
Thank you. Councillor Stuart Carroll, I actually want to ask you about Russia, and particularly the situation with Vladimir Putin, who increasingly seems to be able to do whatever he wants, put odd bits of the periodic table in people's drinks and food, and there seems to be no particular backlash against that. I think to many outsiders it looks like he moves the international chessboard very shrewdly. And when I speak to a lot of my Russian colleagues and Russian friends, they say that one of the things he's very effective at doing internally and within Russia is playing to their history and the feeling that They've never been respected for what they did in the Second World War, and they've never been respected as a nation. Just be interested to get your thoughts on how you think the UK and the world should be approaching Russia.
So I just want to test a little bit the idea that we haven't done much. I think in the wake of the Salisbury attack, the UK was pretty effective. I mean, it's before my time, so I'm not taking credit for it, in galvanising widespread international support for expelling diplomats. Russia is no longer in the... okay. Employees of the...
I love it. Heckling
Russian
from an ambassador.
Yeah. You can come again.
Yes.
And that was a good example of something where we actually reached out. The Europeans were supportive, the US was supportive, and many other countries around the world. And we, there was a push to get Russia back in the G7, and the UK, it's well known, made it clear that we didn't think that just because there'd been some progress in relation to Ukraine, that with all of the other things and the trouble it's doing, the troublemaking in Syria, and with the concerns we have with Salisbury, that was acceptable. So I think we've been pretty robust and clear on that. Obviously, and I mentioned it and announced it yesterday, we're also going to bring into effect a UK Magnitsky law. I think Latvia has one. So as well as, look, we've got the two pioneers of Magnitsky, because the Canadians have one and the Latvians have one. And that's basically saying that if you commit serious human rights abuses, and you could expand it to include other violations of international humanitarian law, then the individuals responsible for it will be subject to visa bans and asset freezes. And one of the interesting, I think the thing I like about the model is it wouldn't just apply to Russia. We are getting ready for the legislation we'll put through and the designations we'll make, and it will be much broader than Russia. But it allows you to say, I'm sorry, this behaviour, totally unacceptable. You can't come into this country. You can't sift your money through UK banks. You can't come and send your kids to public school here while you are personally engaging in that behaviour. But unlike some of the other sanctions, you're not punishing the country as a whole, which does, as I think was mentioned, fuel the victim narrative that you do hear in parts of Russian civil society.
Right, final question, gentleman there. You thought I wasn't coming to you, didn't you?
Giving up hope.
Graham Holland, I've just taken early retirement from the Foreign Office. I actually got a Maggie.
Did you work with him?
Sorry?
Did you work with him?
During the early parts, yes. Well, not with, but I was there at the same time as the solicitor side of it.
You're disowning me.
No. I was actually going to say that one of the comments that you made earlier, Boris was actually an extremely popular Foreign Secretary among his staff, certainly in his office, and amongst those of us who dealt with him. That's, by the way. Question is, and say I got a Maggie leaving card as well. It's worrying. There's probably a supply of them in the office. But,
secret stash.
Simon's got a box there. But question is, there is, after so long of discovering it, oil is now started to be extracted from the Falkland Islands. There is soon going to be an election in Argentina. There is a possibility of a change of government that might be a little harsher towards the Falklands and Britain, etc. Do you anticipate, Foreign Secretary, any increased action or threats of action or antagonism during the election campaign against Britain and the Falkland Islands?
Well, I hope not, and I expect not, but of course we'll always protect the Falkland Islands, and in fact I went to see the Falkland Island representation here in the exhibition hall to have a chat with some of their politicians who are over here and to give them that reassurance. So I guess with those sorts of things, you just have to keep your eye very carefully on the situation and monitor it very carefully and telegraph all the right signals that we won't have any malevolent reaction towards the Falklands. And of course things are said in an election that don't get followed through on. So, not just in the UK.
Well, I feel that we have cemented Anglo-Canadian and Latvian relations in this event. It's been very interesting that I don't think we've had a single question on Brexit, have we? Which one you did? Well, sorry, you didn't indicate it, did you? I missed you. I do apologise. Can't call everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks to Onward and ConservativeHome for putting on the event, and thanks to Dominic. Thank you very much.